February the 17th, 1843. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Miani in what would soon become British Sind. Major General Sir Charles James Napier stood atop a small rise, his weathered hands gripping a telescope as he surveyed the enemy force arrayed before him. 22,000 Baluchi warriors stretched across the horizon like a dark tide, their banners snapping in the desert wind, their weapons glinting in the early light. Behind Napier, barely visible in the morning haze, stood his own force, a mere 2,800 men, mostly Indian sepoys, with a handful of British officers and Irish soldiers. The odds were nearly 8-1 against him. Picture this moment. Imagine standing in Napier's boots, feeling the weight of an impossible decision, pressing down on your shoulders like the merciless Indian sun. Any reasonable commander would have retreated. Any sensible general would have waited for reinforcements. Any prudent military mind would have recognized this as a suicide mission and pulled back to fight another day. Charles Napier was not a reasonable man. What happened next would become one of the most audacious military victories in British imperial history. A triumph so improbable that it would transform the entire political landscape of northwestern India and establish British dominance over a region that had remained unconquered for millennia. But to understand how 2,800 men defeated an army nearly 8 times their size, you need to understand the man who led them into what should have been certain annihilation. You need to understand Charles James Napier. Born in 1782 into a military family, Napier was the embodiment of everything that made the British Empire both magnificent and terrible. His father, Colonel George Napier, had served with distinction in the American Revolutionary War, while his brothers would go on to become legendary figures in their own right. William as the historian who would chronicle the Peninsular War, and George as the conqueror of Sindh's northern territories. But Charles possessed something his brothers lacked, an almost supernatural ability to inspire absolute loyalty in his men while simultaneously terrifying his enemies with his unpredictable tactical brilliance. The year is 1841, and the British Empire is licking its wounds after the catastrophic First Afghan War. The disastrous retreat from Kabul has left British prestige in tatters across the subcontinent. Native rulers who once cowered before British power are beginning to question whether the East India Company's military might is as invincible as they once believed. In the courts of Hyderabad, Mysore, and the Maratha territories, whispers spread like wildfire. Perhaps the British can be beaten after all. But then came Sindh. The province of Sindh, stretching along the lower Indus River from the Arabian Sea to the Punjab, had remained largely independent under the rule of the Talpur Mirs, Baluchi chieftains who had carved out their own kingdom in the chaos following the collapse of Mughal power. For decades, they had managed to maintain their independence through a careful balance of diplomacy, tribute, and the occasional display of military force. The British, preoccupied with more pressing concerns in Afghanistan and Burma, had been content to leave Sindh alone as long as the Mirs remained neutral and allowed British merchants access to the Indus River trade routes. That delicate balance was about to be shattered forever. The spark that would ignite the conquest of Sindh came, ironically, from British desperation rather than British ambition. Following the Afghan disaster, the East India Company found itself desperately short of funds. The cost of maintaining armies across the subcontinent was bleeding the company treasury dry, while the directors in London demanded both reduced expenditures and increased revenues. The solution, as it so often was in the age of empire, lay in conquest and plunder. Lord Ellenborough, the Governor-General of India, cast his eyes westward toward Sindh with the calculating gaze of a man who understood that sometimes the best defense is a profitable offense. The Talpur Mirs, he reasoned, possessed considerable wealth accumulated from centuries of Indus River trade. More importantly, their strategic position controlling the river routes made them either valuable allies or dangerous enemies. Since the British had learned the hard way that allies could prove unreliable, The logic of imperial arithmetic suggested that conquest was the more prudent course. But Ellenborough needed a pretext. In the chess game of 19th-century imperialism, naked aggression was considered unseemly. One needed reasons, preferably reasons that could be justified to the Court of Directors in London, and if necessary, to Parliament itself. The Governor-General found his excuse in the Treaty of 1839, a document the Mirs had signed under duress during the First Afghan War. The treaty contained deliberately ambiguous clauses about military support and tribute payments, clauses that could be interpreted as breaches of agreement if one squinted hard enough and possessed sufficient imperial imagination. Enter Charles Napier. In 1842, Napier received orders that would change his life and alter the course of history. He was to proceed to Sindh as the new commander of British forces in the region, ostensibly to negotiate with the Mirs about their alleged treaty violations. His official instructions were diplomatically worded and carefully ambiguous. His unofficial instructions, delivered in private conversations with Ellenborough, were considerably more direct. Find a way to provoke the Mirs into war, then crush them completely. Napier understood his mission with crystal clarity. "We have no right to seize Sindh," he wrote in his private diary. "Yet we shall do so, and a very advantageous, useful, humane piece of rascality it will be." The moral contradiction didn't trouble him. He was a soldier of the Empire, and the Empire's needs transcended individual conscience. Besides, Napier had convinced himself that British rule would ultimately benefit the people of Sindh more than the corrupt and feudal system of the Mirs. You might wonder how a man could reconcile such blatant aggression with personal honor. The answer lies in understanding the peculiar psychology of imperial conquest, where civilizing missions and strategic necessities became so intertwined that even the conquerors lost track of where justification ended and genuine belief began. Napier was neither a monster nor a saint. He was a product of his time, shaped by an empire that had learned to dress its appetite for expansion in the noble garments of moral improvement. The diplomatic dance that followed Napier's arrival in Sindh was as predictable as it was cynical. The Mirs, understanding perfectly well what was happening, attempted to navigate between compliance and resistance. They paid some tributes while disputing others, offered concessions while maintaining their dignity, and desperately sought to avoid giving Napier the clear pretext for war that everyone knew he was seeking. But Napier was a master of imperial provocation. Every diplomatic exchange was crafted to create maximum humiliation for the Mirs while providing minimum justification for their resistance. Treaty obligations were interpreted in the harshest possible light. Minor infractions were magnified into major breaches of faith. Reasonable requests for clarification were treated as stalling tactics and evidence of bad faith. The breaking point came in January 1843, when Napier demanded that the Mirs disband their armies and accept permanent British garrisons in their major cities. The demand was deliberately impossible to accept. No ruler could remain in power after agreeing to such complete subjugation. When the Mirs inevitably refused, Napier had his pretext. "The Mirs have chosen war," he declared, though everyone understood that the choice had been crafted to ensure only one possible outcome. But declaring war and winning it were two entirely different propositions. As Napier assembled his forces in early 1843, the mathematical reality of his situation would have daunted any ordinary commander. The British military presence in Sindh consisted of approximately 2,800 men, the 22nd Regiment of Foot, Cheshire Regiment, a handful of other British units, several regiments of Bengal native infantry, and supporting artillery and cavalry. Against them, the Mirs could field an estimated 35,000 warriors, though intelligence suggested that not all of these would be concentrated in a single location. The Baluchi military tradition was formidable. These were not parade ground soldiers or ceremonial guards. They were battle-hardened warriors from tribes that had been fighting for survival in the harsh borderlands between Persia, Afghanistan, and India for centuries. They possessed intimate knowledge of the local terrain, the advantage of fighting on their home ground, and the desperate motivation of men defending their homeland against foreign invaders. Moreover, the Baluchi forces included significant numbers of Arab mercenaries and Afghan veterans who had gained experience fighting against British forces in the recent Afghan campaigns. These men knew British tactics, understood British weaknesses, and harbored personal grudges against the empire that had bloodied their homelands. The strategic situation facing Napier would have challenged even Wellington or Marlborough. Sindh's geography favored defenders, vast stretches of desert broken by river systems that could become either barriers or highways depending on the season. The Indus River and its tributaries created natural defensive lines, while the scattered oasis settlements could serve as fortified strongpoints for a determined enemy. Supply lines represented an even greater challenge. Napier's forces were operating hundreds of miles from their nearest secure base, connected to British India by tenuous routes through hostile territory. Every bullet, every cannonball, every grain of rice had to be transported across landscapes where a single successful raid could leave an entire army stranded and starving. Yet Napier possessed advantages that would prove decisive, though their full significance wouldn't become apparent until the morning of February 17th at Miani. The first was technological. British artillery and musketry represented a quantum leap beyond anything the Mirs could deploy. The second was organizational. British military engineering had created logistical systems that could sustain extended campaigns far from home bases. The third was tactical. European military doctrine had evolved techniques for maximizing the effectiveness of smaller, disciplined forces against larger, less organized enemies. But perhaps most important was Napier himself. Charles Napier understood war in ways that transcended textbook knowledge or staff college training. He possessed that rare combination of strategic vision and tactical flexibility that allowed him to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. More crucially, he had spent decades learning how to lead men in impossible situations, how to inspire soldiers to achieve feats that defied rational calculation. His approach to the Sindh campaign demonstrated this understanding perfectly. Rather than attempting to occupy territory or engage the enemy's main forces directly, Napier adopted a strategy of rapid movement and psychological warfare, designed to fragment the Mirs' coalition before it could achieve full coordination. He would strike fast, strike hard, and strike where the enemy least expected, using mobility and surprise to offset his numerical disadvantage. The campaign began in earnest in February 1843, when Napier learned that Mir Sher Muhammad, one of the principal Talpur rulers, had assembled a massive army at Miani, a small settlement roughly 15 miles north of Hyderabad. Intelligence reports suggested that Sher Muhammad commanded approximately 22,000 men, making this the largest concentration of enemy forces Napier was likely to face. Any conventional military wisdom would have counseled extreme caution. The prudent course would have been to avoid battle until reinforcements arrived, or at minimum to choose the time and place of engagement more carefully. Napier could have fallen back to more defensible positions, consolidated his forces, and waited for the enemy to make the first mistake. Instead, he chose to attack immediately. Picture the scene on the evening of February 16th as Napier's column made its final approach toward Miani. The desert air was crisp and clear, stars brilliant in the unpolluted sky above the endless expanse of sand and scrub. Around the scattered campfires, British officers huddled over maps while sepoy soldiers cleaned their muskets and checked their ammunition pouches. Everyone understood what tomorrow would bring. A battle against odds so overwhelming that survival itself would constitute victory. The mood among the troops was remarkable. Rather than the grim resignation you might expect from men facing near certain death, Napier's soldiers displayed an almost euphoric confidence. This wasn't blind optimism or imperial arrogance. It was the product of absolute trust in their commander's judgment. These men had served with Napier long enough to witness his tactical genius firsthand. They had seen him transform desperate situations into brilliant victories through sheer force of will and strategic insight. "The general," one Irish sergeant wrote to his wife that evening, "has that look in his eye that means tomorrow we'll do something that will be talked about for 100 years. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. As dawn broke on February 17, 1843, the two armies faced each other across the plain of Miani like opposing chess pieces awaiting the first move. The Baluchi force was a sight to inspire both awe and terror. Rank upon rank of warriors stretching across the horizon, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun, their battle cries echoing across the desert like thunder. They had positioned themselves in a strong defensive formation, anchored on both flanks by natural obstacles and protected by field fortifications that their engineers had constructed during the night. Mir Sher Muhammad had chosen his ground well. The Baluchi position commanded excellent fields of fire while providing multiple escape routes if the battle turned against them. Their artillery, though inferior to British guns, was positioned to maximize its effectiveness, while their cavalry held the flanks where they could exploit any breakthrough or cover a general retreat. Against this formidable array, Napier deployed his tiny force with the precision of a master craftsman arranging his tools. The 22nd Foot formed the backbone of his line, their scarlet uniforms bright as blood against the brown landscape. The Bengal native infantry regiments took position on either flank, their officers, British to a man, checking and rechecking their soldiers' equipment. The artillery crews, perhaps the most crucial element of Napier's entire strategy, unlimbered their guns with practiced efficiency. But the real key to what followed lay not in troop dispositions or artillery placement, but in Charles Napier's understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. He had spent the previous weeks not just planning his tactical approach, but carefully studying the cultural and political dynamics of his enemy. The Baluchi Confederation was held together by personal loyalties and shared traditions rather than centralized command structures. Their greatest strength, the fierce independence of individual tribal leaders, was also their most exploitable weakness. Napier's battle plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to outflank or outmaneuver the Baluchi position, he would attack directly into their strongest point, using concentrated firepower to shatter their line at its most critical junction. The plan depended on perfect timing, absolute discipline, and a level of tactical coordination that would challenge even veteran European armies. It depended, in other words, on everything going exactly right. The battle began at precisely 8 a.m. when Napier ordered his artillery to open fire. The British guns, superior in both range and accuracy to anything the Baluchis possessed, began systematically dismantling the enemy's defensive positions. Shell after shell crashed into the Baluchi ranks, creating gaps in their formation and spreading confusion throughout their lines. But artillery alone could not win the battle. The Baluchi warriors, displaying the courage that had made them legendary throughout Central Asia, held their positions despite the devastating bombardment. Their return fire, though less accurate, was sufficient to inflict serious casualties on Napier's exposed forces. Within minutes, it became clear that this would be no easy victory. The decisive moment came when Napier ordered the 22nd Foot to advance in column directly toward the center of the Baluchi line. This was the moment when mathematical odds ceased to matter, when individual courage and collective discipline would determine the fate of nations. Picture those men. Farmers' sons from Cheshire, Irish labourers from Dublin, Welsh miners from the valleys, marching steadily forward into a storm of musket fire and artillery shells, their faces set with the grim determination of soldiers who understood that retreat meant death and victory meant immortality. The Baluchi response was everything Napier had hoped for and everything his men had feared. Thousands of warriors rose from their defensive positions and charged toward the advancing British column, their battle cries filling the air, their weapons raised high above their heads. It was a magnificent sight, terrifying and beautiful simultaneously. The flower of Baluchi manhood throwing itself against the disciplined ranks of the East India Company's finest regiment. What happened next demonstrated why European military techniques had proven so devastatingly effective against traditional armies throughout the world. The 22nd Foot, instead of meeting the Baluchi charge head-on, executed a complex tactical maneuver that transformed their column into a series of interlocking firing lines. Suddenly, instead of facing a narrow target, the charging Baluchis found themselves advancing into a killing field where every step forward exposed them to increasingly concentrated musket fire. The volley firing was devastating. Rank after rank of Baluchi warriors fell before they could close with their enemies, cut down by disciplined musketry that delivered far more firepower than their numbers suggested possible. Yet still they came, driven by courage and desperation, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades in their determination to break the British line. For 30 minutes, the outcome hung in balance. The British line wavered under the ferocity of the Baluchi assault, and there were moments when it seemed that sheer weight of numbers might overwhelm Napier's tactical brilliance. Individual acts of heroism on both sides created legends that would be told for generations. British sergeants rallying their men with curses and bayonet charges. Baluchi chiefs leading their retainers in suicide attacks against the British guns. Sepoy soldiers holding their positions despite wounds that would have felled lesser men. The turning point came when Napier himself led a cavalry charge against the Baluchi left flank. This was not the action of a prudent general. Commanding officers were supposed to remain safely behind their lines, directing operations through subordinates. But Napier understood that sometimes leadership required personal example, that there were moments when the sight of their commander sharing their dangers could inspire soldiers to achieve the impossible. The cavalry charge, though small in numbers, struck at precisely the right moment and place. The Baluchi flank, already weakened by artillery fire and struggling to maintain cohesion under the British infantry assault, collapsed under this new pressure. What had been an organized defensive line suddenly became a mass of confused and isolated units, each fighting its own desperate battle without coordination or mutual support. Mir Sher Mohammad, watching his carefully planned defense disintegrating before his eyes, made the decision that would seal his fate and that of his entire confederation. Rather than ordering a general retreat while his forces still maintained some semblance of organization, he chose to commit his reserves in a final, desperate attempt to break the British center. It was a brave decision, but it was also a fatal mistake. The reserve charge struck the British line with tremendous force, and for a few terrifying minutes it seemed as though the Baluchis might achieve their breakthrough. British casualties mounted rapidly as hand-to-hand fighting raged along the entire front. Officers fell alongside their men, while sepoy soldiers fought with bayonets and rifle butts against Baluchi swords and spears. But Napier had anticipated this moment. As the Baluchi reserves committed themselves to their final assault, he unleashed the tactical masterstroke that would decide the entire campaign. British artillery, which had been carefully repositioned during the infantry fighting, opened fire with canister shot directly into the flanks of the charging enemy. The effect was catastrophic. Thousands of iron balls swept through the Baluchi ranks like a scythe through wheat, creating carnage on a scale that defied description. The Baluchi army, which had fought with magnificent courage for over an hour, finally broke. What began as an organized retreat quickly became a rout as panic spread through the surviving ranks. The carefully constructed confederation that had taken decades to build dissolved in minutes as individual tribal leaders fled with their remaining followers toward the safety of the desert. The Battle of Miani was over. The impossible had happened. 2,800 British and Indian soldiers had defeated 22,000 Baluchi warriors in a direct confrontation that should have resulted in British annihilation. The casualties told the story of the battle's one-sided conclusion. Approximately 5,000 Baluchi dead and wounded against fewer than 300 British and sepoy losses. But numbers alone cannot capture the significance of what had occurred on that February morning. The Battle of Miani represented far more than a military victory. It was a demonstration of technological and organizational superiority that would reshape the entire political landscape of northwestern India. News of the impossible British triumph spread across the subcontinent like wildfire, carrying with it a message that native rulers understood with crystal clarity. Resistance to British power was not merely difficult, it was futile. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the full extent of Napier's strategic vision. Rather than simply occupying the battlefield and declaring victory, he moved immediately to exploit his triumph. Within hours of the Baluchi retreat, British forces were advancing on Hyderabad, the capital of Sindh and seat of the Talpur Confederacy. The remaining Mirs, their military power shattered and their political authority destroyed, found themselves with no choice but to submit to British demands. But Napier's conquest of Sindh involved more than military action. It required the complete transformation of an entire society. The Talpur system, based on feudal relationships and tribal loyalties, had to be replaced with British administrative structures. Local customs and laws needed to be codified and, where necessary, modified to align with British concepts of justice and efficiency. Trade routes that had operated for centuries under traditional arrangements required reorganization to serve imperial economic interests. You might think that such comprehensive social engineering would provoke widespread resistance, but Napier proved as skilled at administration as he was at warfare. His approach to governing Sindh demonstrated the same combination of pragmatism and vision that had characterized his military campaign. Where local customs supported order and prosperity, he preserved them. Where traditional practices conflicted with British interests or humanitarian principles, he modified them gradually, rather than through revolutionary change. The economic transformation was particularly dramatic. Under the Mirs, Sindh's economy had been largely subsistence-based, with limited commercial development and primitive infrastructure. British rule brought capital investment, modern transportation systems, and integration into global markets that transformed the province from a backwater into a vital link in the imperial commercial network. The Indus River, previously used mainly for local transportation, became a major highway connecting British India with Central Asian markets. New irrigation systems, designed by British engineers using the latest hydraulic technology, transformed thousands of acres of desert into productive agricultural land. Telegraph lines and postal services connected Sindh with the wider world, while British legal systems replaced the arbitrary justice of feudal courts. Yet, this transformation came at a cost that extended far beyond the immediate casualties of the battlefield. Traditional social structures that had provided stability and identity for centuries were swept away by the tide of modernization. Local elites who had wielded power for generations found themselves reduced to ceremonial figures or administrative functionaries. Religious and cultural practices that conflicted with British sensibilities faced pressure to change or disappear. The human dimension of conquest is always more complex than military histories suggest. For every Baluchi warrior who died at Miani, there were dozens of family members whose lives were fundamentally altered by British rule. Widows who had enjoyed traditional protections under tribal law discovered that British legal systems offered different forms of security and different types of vulnerability. Children who would have inherited traditional roles and responsibilities found themselves navigating an entirely new social order where success required different skills and different loyalties. Napier himself was not blind to these complexities. His personal correspondence reveals a man genuinely concerned with the welfare of his new subjects, yet constrained by the demands of imperial policy and the limitations of cross-cultural understanding. He worked to minimize the disruptions of conquest while maximizing its benefits, but he remained fundamentally committed to the belief that British civilization represented an improvement over traditional systems. "We have given them peace where they had war, law where they had arbitrariness, prosperity where they had poverty," he wrote to his brother. "If that is not justification enough for what we have done, then no justification is possible." The broader strategic implications of the Sind conquest extended far beyond the borders of the province itself. The success at Miani sent shock waves throughout the region, fundamentally altering the balance of power from the Arabian Sea to the Himalayas. Native rulers who had been contemplating resistance to British expansion suddenly found themselves reconsidering their options. The mathematical impossibility of what had occurred at Miani suggested that conventional military wisdom no longer applied when facing British forces. In Afghanistan, where tribal leaders were still celebrating their victory over British forces in the recent war, news of Miani arrived like a cold wind from the south. The same military system that had been humiliated in the passes of the Hindu Kush had just achieved total victory against odds that should have guaranteed defeat. The lesson was clear. British military power was not diminished by the Afghan disaster, merely redirected toward more achievable objectives. The Punjab, where Maharaja Sher Singh was carefully watching the expansion of British influence, received the news with particular concern. The Sikh military machine, considered the most formidable indigenous force in the subcontinent, had been counting on Baluchi resistance to serve as a buffer against British expansion westward. The collapse of Sind removed that buffer and brought British forces directly to the Punjab's southern borders. Even in distant courts like those of Nepal and Burma, rulers who had never heard of Charles Napier or the Battle of Miani found themselves adjusting their policies in response to what had occurred. The demonstration effect of British military capability had implications that extended far beyond the immediate theatre of operations, serving as a deterrent to potential resistance and an encouragement to potential collaboration throughout the region. The technological lessons of Miani were equally significant. The battle had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of disciplined firepower when properly coordinated with tactical mobility. European military observers, studying reports of the engagement, recognized that traditional concepts of numerical superiority were becoming obsolete in the face of industrial-age weaponry and professional military organization. Artillery proved particularly decisive, not merely because of its destructive power, but because of its psychological impact. The ability to deliver accurate, sustained fire at ranges beyond the reach of traditional weapons created what military theorists would later recognize as a fundamental asymmetry in battlefield dynamics. Armies that lacked comparable firepower found themselves facing not just tactical disadvantage, but strategic impossibility. The organizational superiority demonstrated by Napier's forces was equally important. The British military system had evolved techniques for maintaining unit cohesion and command coordination under extreme stress that surpassed anything available to traditional armies. The ability to execute complex tactical maneuvers while under fire, to maintain disciplined volleys during close-quarters combat, and to coordinate artillery and infantry action in real time represented capabilities that could not be improvised or quickly acquired. Supply and logistics systems that supported extended operations far from home bases gave British forces strategic flexibility that their opponents could not match. The capacity to maintain thousands of soldiers in fighting condition while operating hundreds of miles from secure supply sources represented a technological and organizational achievement that transformed the very nature of military campaigning. But perhaps the most significant lesson of Miani concerned the psychological dimensions of warfare in the imperial age. The battle demonstrated that military effectiveness was not simply a matter of numbers, weapons, or tactical skill. It was fundamentally about the ability to project power across cultural and geographical boundaries in ways that convinced potential opponents that resistance was futile. The aftermath of Miani revealed how military victory could be leveraged into political transformation on a scale far exceeding the immediate battlefield results. Napier's triumph did not merely defeat one Baluchi army, it shattered the entire system of relationships that had maintained Sindhi independence for centuries. Local leaders who might have continued resistance under different circumstances chose submission instead, calculating that collaboration offered better prospects than continued defiance. This psychological dynamic would become a cornerstone of British imperial expansion throughout the 19th century. The demonstration that seemingly impossible military victories were not only possible but reproducible created a climate of anticipation and resignation that made future conquests easier and less costly. Potential opponents faced the choice between certain defeat through resistance and possible survival through accommodation. The news of Miani reached London in April 1843, carried by the swift packet ships that connected Britain with its Indian Empire. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. A public that had been dismayed by the disasters in Afghanistan suddenly found itself celebrating a victory that seemed to restore British military prestige at a single stroke. Newspaper editorials proclaimed Napier a hero worthy of comparison with Wellington and Nelson, while politicians who had been questioning the costs of imperial expansion suddenly rediscovered their enthusiasm for British greatness. The Court of Directors of the East India Company, initially skeptical about the legality and wisdom of the Sindh conquest, found their concerns evaporating in the face of overwhelming public approval. The financial benefits of conquest, control over lucrative trade routes, access to new markets, and elimination of tribute payments to local rulers more than justified the costs of the campaign. What had begun as a questionable military adventure had transformed into a profitable business proposition. Queen Victoria herself took note of the victory, commenting in her diary that General Napier's achievement reflects the finest traditions of British arms and demonstrates that our forces remain invincible when properly led. The royal approval carried significant political weight, helping to silence critics who had questioned the morality of unprovoked aggression against the Mirs. But the most significant response came from other colonial administrators throughout the British Empire, who recognized that Miani had established new precedents for the use of military force in imperial expansion. The battle had demonstrated that small, well-trained forces could achieve decisive victories against seemingly overwhelming odds, provided they possessed technological superiority and competent leadership. In Canada, administrators dealing with recurring tensions along the American border took note of tactics that might prove useful in future conflicts. In Australia, officials struggling to maintain control over vast territories with limited military resources saw possibilities for more aggressive approaches to indigenous resistance. In South Africa, where Boer expansion was creating new challenges for British authority, colonial governors began planning campaigns that borrowed heavily from Napier's strategic innovations. The precedent established at Miani would influence British military doctrine for decades to come. Staff colleges began teaching the battle as a textbook example of how superior organization and technology could overcome numerical disadvantage. Military manuals incorporated lessons learned about the coordination of artillery and infantry, the use of disciplined firepower against mass attacks, and the psychological dimensions of colonial warfare. Yet, the victory at Miani also revealed the limitations and contradictions inherent in imperial conquest. The same technological and organizational advantages that made British forces nearly invincible in conventional battles created dependencies that could prove strategically vulnerable. The logistics systems that supported extended campaigns required vast resources and extensive infrastructure that were themselves potential targets for enemy action. Moreover, the psychological effects that made conquest possible also created expectations that could become burdensome. Each spectacular victory raised the bar for future military achievements, while each setback carried the potential to shatter the aura of invincibility that made further conquests feasible. The British military machine had become trapped in a cycle where success demanded ever more impressive demonstrations of superiority. The human cost of this imperial dynamic extended far beyond the immediate casualties of specific battles. The transformation of Sindh from an independent province into a component of British India required the systematic dismantling of traditional social structures and their replacement with alien institutions. Local leaders who had derived their authority from centuries of tribal tradition found themselves displaced by British administrators who understood efficiency but not legitimacy. Religious and cultural practices that had provided meaning and identity for generations faced pressure to conform to British expectations of proper behavior. Educational systems that had transmitted traditional knowledge for centuries were replaced with curricula designed to produce clerks and administrators for imperial service. Economic relationships that had evolved over millennia to suit local conditions were reorganized to serve global markets and imperial priorities. The Baluchi people themselves, the supposed beneficiaries of British civilization, experienced these changes as a form of cultural conquest that was perhaps more devastating than military defeat. Their language, their customs, their understanding of proper relationships between rulers and ruled, all of these faced systematic challenge from administrators who genuinely believed they were improving local conditions while remaining largely blind to what was being destroyed in the process. Individual stories from this period reveal the human complexity of imperial transformation. Baluchi nobles who accepted British authority found themselves with comfortable pensions but no meaningful role in governing their former subjects. Soldiers who had fought bravely at Miani and survived discovered that their military skills were no longer valued in a society where law enforcement was the province of professional police forces. Merchants who had prospered under traditional trade arrangements faced new regulations and competitors that made their established practices obsolete. Yet, not all the changes were negative, even from local perspectives. British rule brought genuine improvements in certain areas. More predictable legal systems, better public health measures, and expanded educational opportunities for those willing to adapt to new requirements. The elimination of endemic warfare between rival tribal groups allowed economic development that would have been impossible under traditional arrangements. Modern transportation and communication systems connected Sindh with the broader world in ways that created new opportunities for ambitious individuals. The construction of the first railway lines through Sindh, beginning in the 1850s, exemplified both the benefits and the disruptions of British rule. The railways brought unprecedented economic growth, connecting local producers with global markets and reducing transportation costs dramatically. But they also displaced thousands of workers whose livelihoods had depended on traditional transport systems, while the need for railway labor brought immigrants from other parts of India who competed with local workers and altered the demographic balance of entire regions. Charles Napier himself remained in Sindh for several years after his military triumph, serving as the first British governor of the province and overseeing its integration into the imperial administrative system. His approach to governance reflected the same combination of pragmatism and vision that had characterized his military leadership. Where local institutions could be adapted to serve British purposes, he preserved them. Where traditional practices conflicted with imperial needs or humanitarian principles, he worked to modify them gradually, rather than through revolutionary change. His correspondence during this period reveals a man genuinely concerned with the welfare of his subjects, yet increasingly frustrated by the complexities of cross-cultural administration. "It is easier to conquer a province than to govern it wisely," he wrote to his wife. Military victory provides clarity of purpose that civilian administration lacks. Every decision creates new problems. Every solution generates new complications. The legal system established under Napier's administration exemplified these challenges. British concepts of justice, based on written law and formal procedures, had to be reconciled with traditional practices that emphasized customary authority and personal relationships. The result was a hybrid system that satisfied neither British expectations of legal consistency nor local demands for familiar procedures. Property rights presented similar difficulties. British law required clear documentation of ownership and precise boundary definitions that often conflicted with traditional arrangements based on usage rights and communal responsibility. The process of creating modern property records involved thousands of individual disputes that revealed fundamental differences in how the two cultures understood the relationship between people and land. Religious and cultural questions proved equally complex. British administrators, committed to principles of religious tolerance, attempted to avoid interference with local practices while maintaining order and implementing humanitarian reforms. The abolition of practices considered barbaric by British standards, such as female infanticide and certain forms of ritual violence, required careful negotiation with religious authorities who viewed such customs as essential elements of proper social order. Education policy reflected these same tensions between imperial needs and local traditions. The British believed that modern education was essential for economic development and social progress, but their educational systems were designed to produce citizens for a very different type of society than the one that existed in Sindh. The result was often a generation of young people who were alienated from traditional culture without being fully integrated into British colonial society. The long-term consequences of the conquest of Sindh extended far beyond the province itself, influencing the development of British India and the broader trajectory of imperial expansion. The strategic position of Sindh, controlling access to the Indus River and commanding the approaches to Afghanistan and Central Asia, made it a crucial component in the defense of British India against potential Russian expansion. The Great Game, the strategic competition between Britain and Russia for influence in Central Asia, would dominate British policy in the region for the remainder of the 19th century. Sindh's position as a buffer against Russian expansion through Afghanistan made its conquest appear not merely profitable, but strategically essential. The Battle of Meani, viewed from this perspective, represented not just a brilliant tactical victory, but a crucial move in a global chess game that would determine the balance of power between the world's great empires. The economic integration of Sindh into the British imperial system created new patterns of trade and development that reshaped the entire region. The Indus River, previously important mainly for local transportation, became a major highway connecting British India with Central Asian markets. Cotton production, encouraged by British demand for raw materials, transformed large areas of Sindh from subsistence agriculture into commercial farming oriented toward global markets. The construction of irrigation systems, using British engineering expertise and Indian capital, dramatically expanded the amount of land available for cultivation. These projects represented massive investments in infrastructure that generated employment and prosperity, but they also created new forms of dependency on global markets and imperial policies. When cotton prices fluctuated in response to events in distant markets, the effects rippled through Sindhi society in ways that would have been impossible under traditional economic arrangements. The demographic changes accompanying British rule were equally significant. The administrative needs of colonial government brought thousands of clerks, policemen, and other officials from other parts of India, creating new ethnic and linguistic minorities within Sindh. The expansion of trade opportunities attracted merchants and entrepreneurs from Punjab, Gujarat, and other commercial regions, altering the economic balance between different communities. Military recruitment for British Indian forces drew young men from Sindhi families into a professional army that served throughout the empire, exposing them to different cultures and ideas while removing them from traditional social roles. Veterans returning from service in Burma, Afghanistan, or other theaters brought new perspectives and skills that gradually transformed local society. The missionary activity that accompanied British rule introduced Christianity as a new religious option, while challenging traditional Islamic and Hindu practices. Although conversions remained limited, the presence of Christian missions created new educational opportunities and medical services, while contributing to broader cultural changes that affected all religious communities. Urban development under British rule transformed the physical landscape of Sindh's major cities. Karachi, previously a small fishing village, grew into a major port connecting Sindh with global shipping networks. Hyderabad expanded from a traditional administrative center into a modern commercial hub with banks, telegraph offices, and railway connections. Smaller towns throughout the province acquired new institutions, courts, police stations, schools, and hospitals that reflected British concepts of proper urban organization. Yet, these changes also created new forms of social stratification and economic inequality. The benefits of modernization were not distributed equally across all communities or social classes. Those who could adapt to British requirements, learning English, acquiring modern skills, accepting new forms of authority, prospered under the colonial system. Those who could not or would not adapt often found themselves marginalized in a society that no longer valued their traditional contributions. The cultural legacy of the conquest proved equally complex and enduring. The introduction of English as the language of administration and higher education created new opportunities for advancement while potentially threatening the vitality of local languages. The establishment of British-style schools and colleges provided access to modern knowledge, while challenging traditional forms of learning and cultural transmission. Literature, art, and music in Sindh all felt the impact of British rule as local artists and intellectuals struggled to maintain cultural authenticity while engaging with new ideas and influences. Some embraced Western forms and themes, creating hybrid cultural expressions that reflected the complexity of colonial experience. Others retreated into traditionalism, emphasizing the preservation of ancient customs as a form of cultural resistance. The political consciousness that would eventually challenge British rule also had its roots in the changes initiated by conquest. The very education and legal systems that were designed to create loyal imperial subjects also provided the tools for understanding concepts like nationalism, democracy, and self-determination. Young Sindhis who learned English and studied Western political philosophy began to question why the principles of freedom and justice that the British claimed to represent should not apply to their own people. The administrative efficiency that made British rule effective also created new forms of political organization and communication that would eventually serve independence movements. The railways and telegraph systems that connected Sindh with the rest of British India also facilitated the spread of political ideas and the coordination of resistance activities. The legal system that was designed to maintain order also provided venues for challenging colonial policies through constitutional means. As the 19th century progressed, the memory of Miani began to acquire different meanings for different communities within Sindh. For British administrators and military officers, it remained a glorious example of imperial valor and tactical brilliance. For Baluchi and other local communities, it gradually became a symbol of lost independence and cultural subjugation. For Indian nationalists, it represented both the power of imperial military machinery and the possibility that seemingly invincible systems could be challenged and ultimately overcome. The centenary of the Battle of Miani in 1943 occurred during World War II, when British India was convulsed by the independence movement and the question of partition. The irony was inescapable. A battle that had once demonstrated the invincibility of British power was being commemorated at a time when that power was clearly approaching its end. The same railway systems and telegraph networks that had consolidated British rule were now serving independence movements that would soon drive the British from the subcontinent entirely. Yet the legacy of Napier's conquest cannot be measured solely in terms of political and military outcomes. The transformation of Sindh under British rule created new forms of society, economy, and culture that would continue to evolve long after independence. The legal systems, educational institutions, and administrative structures established during the colonial period provided foundations for modern Pakistan, even as they were modified to serve new purposes and reflect different values. The agricultural and industrial development initiated under British rule created economic capabilities that would prove essential for independent development. The irrigation systems that British engineers had designed to serve imperial commercial interests became crucial infrastructure for feeding Pakistan's growing population. The transportation networks that had connected Sindh with global markets continued to serve the needs of an independent nation trying to build its own economy. The English language and Western educational concepts that had been introduced as tools of imperial control became resources for participating in global scientific, technological, and cultural exchanges. The legal and administrative traditions that had been designed to serve colonial purposes were adapted to support democratic governance and constitutional government. Perhaps most importantly, the experience of conquest, resistance, and transformation had created new forms of identity and political consciousness that transcended traditional ethnic and religious boundaries. The struggle for independence from British rule had required cooperation between communities that had previously seen themselves as separate and often antagonistic. The challenge of building a modern nation-state demanded skills and institutions that drew on both traditional and colonial sources. The Battle of Miani thus represents far more than a military engagement between 2,800 British and Indian soldiers and 22,000 Baluchi warriors on a February morning in 1843. It was a pivotal moment in the transformation of South Asian society, marking the beginning of changes that would reshape the entire region over the following century. The mathematical impossibility of the British victory reflected deeper asymmetries in technology, organization, and strategic vision that would determine the course of imperial expansion throughout the 19th century. Understanding this battle requires recognizing both its immediate tactical brilliance and its broader historical significance. Charles Napier's achievement at Miani was not simply a matter of superior generalship or British military prowess. It was the product of historical forces that were transforming the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world. The Industrial Revolution, the development of modern state institutions, and the expansion of global trade networks had created new forms of power that traditional societies found difficult to comprehend and impossible to resist. Yet, the story of Miani also reveals the human cost of historical transformation. Behind the statistics of casualties and the analysis of tactical innovations lie thousands of individual stories of courage, loss, adaptation, and resistance. The Baluchi warriors who died in the desert that February morning were defending not just their territory, but their entire way of life. The British and Indian soldiers who achieved impossible victory were serving a system they imperfectly understood, fighting for purposes that extended far beyond their immediate military objectives. The ultimate lesson of the Battle of Miani may be that history's most decisive moments often involve far more than the immediate participants can comprehend. The mathematical impossibility that Napier achieved on that desert battlefield reflected the emergence of new forms of power that would reshape the entire world order. The 2,800 men who defeated 22,000 were not just winning a battle, they were participating in the creation of the modern world, with all its achievements and tragedies, its promises and its costs. Today, as we look back across more than a century and a half, the Battle of Miani stands as a reminder of how individual courage and strategic vision can achieve the impossible, while also serving as a warning about the unintended consequences of even the most brilliant victories. The conquest of Sindh began as a military operation designed to solve immediate strategic and financial problems, but it ultimately contributed to changes that would transform 3 continents and affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. The impossible British victory that conquered Sindh thus deserves to be remembered not merely as a remarkable military achievement, but as a crucial moment in the emergence of the modern world. The courage and skill displayed on both sides of that February battle reflected the best qualities of their respective traditions, even as the outcome foreshadowed the end of those traditions and the beginning of something entirely new. In studying what happened at Miani, we gain insight not only into military history, but into the broader processes of historical change that continue to shape our world today.